On the edge of a windswept coastline, where the cliffs of Newport stretch toward the Atlantic like weathered monuments, there is a place where architecture meets drama, not just in design, but in geography itself. The site known as Ochre Court isn't just another patch of land in Rhode Island. It is a natural theater of contrasts, where sky and sea meet stone, and where light plays across the surface of the cliffs in ways that seem almost deliberate. Before there was a mansion, before there was marble or limestone or manicured lawns, there was this land, raw, golden, and defiantly exposed. It's no coincidence that this is where Ochre Court was built. The cliffs owe their color to the earth itself. Rich in iron oxide, the soil reflects warm hues: ochre, bronze, amber, especially at sunrise and dusk, when the sun sits low and turns the coastline into something almost theatrical. This golden light became part of the mansion's identity long before the first foundation stone was laid. Even its name, Ochre Court, was chosen with intention. The builders didn't just want to place their home on this landscape. They wanted it to appear as though it had always belonged to it, as if nature itself had sculpted the facade. But this wasn't an easy place to build. The cliffs, while beautiful, posed logistical and structural challenges. Wind gusts could roar up from the ocean without warning. The salt in the air threatened to corrode and decay anything not built with care. Winter storms crashed against the rocks below with enough force to make entire structures tremble. Yet for the family who commissioned the mansion, these obstacles were not deterrents. They were part of the appeal. This was not a house meant to hide. It was designed to be seen. It was a declaration not just of wealth, but of permanence. From the very beginning, this stretch of land called for something extraordinary. It wasn't enough to build large. Others had already done that. Newport was already dotted with mansions that called themselves cottages, ironic titles for homes that could rival European palaces. What set Ochre Court apart wasn't just its size, but its presence. It didn't blend in. It didn't bow to neighboring structures. It faced the Atlantic like a stone ship, unmoved by time or weather, anchored not just in rock but in ambition. And ambition in this case wasn't only architectural, it was generational. The choice of this precise site, with its elevated views and its inherent symbolism, reflected more than aesthetic preference. It represented an intention to root a legacy into the very geology of the continent. This wasn't just a house to be lived in. It was a monument to endurance. Where other families were choosing spots that offered privacy or proximity to social clubs, the builders of Ochre Court chose exposure. They chose spectacle. They chose cliffs that dared the builder to dream bigger. As the 19th century drew to a close, Newport had become a place where families did more than reside. They performed. Summer after summer, the town transformed into a living opera of wealth, where each mansion played its part in the ongoing theater of prestige. Guests didn't just visit, they witnessed. And in this performance, location was everything. A house built too far inland was simply a house, but a house built at the edge, where land dropped away and the ocean became the front yard, became something else entirely. Ochre Court, perched at this edge, was never meant to be modest. It was never meant to whisper. From its earliest conception, it was designed to command, to catch the light, to dominate its surroundings with quiet certainty. The ocean wasn't just a view, it was a co-star. Today when you walk the cliff walk, that public footpath winding along the shore, you still feel it. Among the many grand houses that line the route, one structure seems to almost rise from the cliffs themselves. It doesn't look as though it was placed there, it looks as though it grew there. Its limestone walls seem to absorb the sunlight in a way that no painted surface could. Its turrets and dormers don't merely echo European castles, they challenge them. Long before you learn the story behind its creation, long before you know the name of the architect or the family who lived inside, you feel that this house matters, that someone, at some point in history, looked at this exposed wild coastline and said, "Here," not just to live, but to define what it meant to live well, not just to escape the city, but to create something that could withstand the ocean winds and the passing of centuries. It began with cliffs. It began with light. It began with a choice to build, not in safety, but at the edge, where everything would be seen, and nothing could be hidden. And once that choice was made, nothing about Ochre Court would be ordinary again. It's easy to imagine that a name like Ochre Court was chosen after the house was complete. A poetic flourish added to give the mansion a touch of character. But that would be a mistake. The name came first. Before a single stone was laid or a drawing approved, the family who envisioned this estate knew exactly what they wanted to call it. The name wasn't an afterthought. It was a mission statement. Ochre refers to the rich, earthy pigment found in the cliffs that line this part of the Newport coastline. Iron oxide gives the soil its distinctive golden hue, glowing at sunrise and blazing at sunset. This ochre-colored earth was more than just scenery. It was identity. It was permanence. And when the family chose to name their mansion Ochre Court, they weren't simply referencing a color. They were making a declaration. This house would not be separate from the land. It would be carved into it, drawn from it, reflective of it. Not just placed on the cliffs, but born of them. The word court carried its own implications. It evoked royalty, ceremony, structure, and hierarchy, but also a sense of openness, a space enclosed but not confined. Together, Ochre Court became a name that suggested both place and presence. It grounded the mansion in its setting while elevating its significance. This wasn't a cottage, nor a retreat. It was a statement written in stone, visible from sea and land alike. From the earliest sketches, the architectural plan aimed to echo this philosophy. The building had to belong to the landscape without vanishing into it. It needed to stand out, but not seem artificial. To achieve this, architect Richard Morris Hunt, who would later be known as one of the most visionary builders of the Gilded Age, looked to the very land itself for inspiration. The site's elevation, light exposure, and winds all influenced the placement of windows, the slope of roofs, the orientation of terraces. Hunt didn't fight the environment. He composed with it. He selected limestone that would absorb and reflect the surrounding hues, allowing the mansion to glow softly in the same golden tones as the cliffs beneath it. Every stone block was cut with such precision that the seams between them nearly vanished, allowing the structure to read as a solid, continuous presence. The facade didn't sit atop the earth. It seemed to emerge from it. And when the sun moved across the sky, the building changed with it, sometimes warm and luminous, sometimes cool and austere, but always in harmony with the world around it. This blending of architecture and setting was more than aesthetic. It reflected an emerging idea among America's upper class, that true refinement wasn't about ostentation, but about a deep and visible connection to place. The European palaces that inspired Gilded Age mansions were often isolated from their landscapes, surrounded by moats or walls. But in Newport, with its rugged coastline and natural drama, the goal was different. The house had to earn its place. Ochre Court accomplished this not by mimicking the wildness of the cliffs, but by offering a controlled counterpoint. Where the landscape was jagged, the mansion was smooth. Where the ocean was chaotic, the design was symmetrical. Yet the materials, the scale, the positioning, all acknowledged the power of the environment. The house did not defy the cliffs. It responded to them. It conversed with them. Even the approach to the house was designed to enhance this relationship. Visitors arrived along curved drives that revealed the mansion gradually, allowing it to rise into view as if it were being introduced by the landscape itself. No abrupt turns, no sudden reveals. The house emerged like a thought slowly forming, deliberate, majestic, inevitable. Inside, the logic continued. Rooms were arranged to maximize light and views. Tall windows opened onto sea vistas. Terraces extended the interior into the outdoors, creating blurred boundaries between house and nature. Decorative motifs, from carved foliage to marine emblems, further reinforced the connection to place. Every element, no matter how luxurious, was tied back to the origin, the Ochre Cliffs. Naming the house after the very earth it stood on wasn't just a gesture of poetic symbolism, it was a promise. The family wasn't building a home to escape the world. They were building a landmark to engage with it, a house that wouldn't just exist in a beautiful setting. It would belong to it. More than a century later, the name still fits. Ochre Court hasn't faded into the background. It hasn't been swallowed by time or upstaged by its neighbors. It still holds its ground at the edge of the continent, light dancing across its surface, answering the cliffs below. It remains what it always set out to be, a house inseparable from its landscape, yet forever elevated above it. In the golden years of America's Gilded Age, building a summer home in Newport wasn't simply about comfort, it was about visibility. It was about making a statement so large, so deliberate, that no one could ignore it. In this world, where fortunes were expanding faster than railroads could carry them, architecture became the loudest voice a family could use to declare its place in the hierarchy of wealth. And among the many homes that rose along the Rhode Island cliffs, none spoke with more clarity and confidence than Ochre Court. This mansion was never intended to be a quiet retreat. From the moment it was imagined, it was designed to dominate. Its sheer scale alone made that intention impossible to miss. More than 50 rooms, over 40,000 square feet of living space, and 3 full stories that rose directly above the pounding Atlantic surf. The final cost exceeded $4.5 million in 1892, a sum that, adjusted for today's economy, would cross well over $150 million. But in this case, price wasn't just a function of ambition. It was the ambition. To understand what Ochre Court really represented, one must understand the culture that birthed it. Newport had become, by the late 19th century, the summer capital of America's new aristocracy. Not those with titles, but those with unimaginable wealth. Railroad barons, steel magnates, oil tycoons, the industrial titans of the age, all descended on this once quaint seaside town for 8 weeks each year to parade their prosperity. Here, the rules of competition were unspoken but deeply felt. You didn't just build bigger, you built better. You didn't follow, you set the tone. Ochre Court entered this arena with eyes wide open. It wasn't built in reaction to others. It was built in anticipation of them. The family behind its construction had already amassed generational wealth through strategic real estate holdings in Manhattan. They didn't need Newport to gain fortune. They needed it to gain stature, to transform financial dominance into cultural legitimacy. But there was danger in doing too little, or too much. A house that looked cheap would be dismissed. A house that looked desperate would be mocked. The solution? Build with so much confidence and taste that no one would question its purpose. Ochre Court was the answer to that challenge. It wasn't merely grand, it was balanced. Monumental in its scale, yes, but executed with such careful elegance that even European visitors, used to palaces and castles, paused in astonishment. The hidden contest in Newport was not unlike a game of chess. Every new mansion was a move, and every party a response. Ochre Court played this game with strategy and boldness. It didn't try to imitate the Vanderbilts' marble house or mimic the extravagance of neighboring estates. It offered a different vision. Quiet authority. A house that didn't shout, but didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Its silhouette alone, steep roofs, limestone glow, sculpted detail, was a signal to anyone paying attention. This family wasn't borrowing prestige. They had arrived with it. The materials themselves told a story. No cost was spared. Limestone from Indiana, interior furnishings from France and Italy, and teams of artisans brought overseas to install carved woodwork and ceiling murals that required years to complete. Electricity, still rare in private homes, was integrated into the mansion from the ground up. Over 1,000 electric fixtures glowed throughout the house at a time when the rest of Newport, as a town, had fewer than 200. This wasn't just technological foresight. It was proof that progress and tradition could live under the same roof, so long as the roof was designed with purpose. Even the house's completion date mattered. It opened its doors in the early 1890s, just before Newport's most competitive seasons began in earnest. At a time when summer cottages were growing into architectural battleships, Ochre Court didn't just enter the race, it reset the bar. The moment guests stepped through its arched entrance into the towering Great Hall, they understood that they weren't merely visiting a home. They were entering a legacy in the making. But what made Ochre Court truly remarkable wasn't just that it participated in the great architectural arms race of its era. It's that it managed to do so with restraint. There was no desperation in its flourishes, no overreaching in its extravagance. Every decision felt deliberate. Every detail, from imported fireplaces to hand-laid parquet floors, told a story of patience and vision. While some mansions tried to scream their worth, Ochre Court stood still and let others come to it. And they did. Artists, aristocrats, diplomats, and observers from both sides of the Atlantic walked through its halls and left changed. Among them, even a Russian Grand Duke, accustomed to the treasures of the Romanov Empire, reportedly confessed that he had never seen such refinement outside of St. Petersburg. In the unspoken language of social dominance, Ochre Court said exactly what it needed to say. This wasn't a vacation home. It was a throne room, cleverly disguised as a summer residence. It didn't just shelter a family. It projected an identity. It shaped perceptions, elevated reputations, and sent a message to every other estate along the cliffs. This is what power looks like when it no longer needs to prove itself. The decision to build Ochre Court in the image of a French château was not made out of whimsy or nostalgia. It was a calculated act of translation, one that lifted the vocabulary of European aristocracy and gave it a distinctly American accent. At a time when the United States was asserting itself as a global power, the elite class was doing the same within architecture, importing the visual language of old-world nobility and reassembling it on American soil. For families like the one behind Ochre Court, building a French chateau in Rhode Island wasn't about imitation. It was about inheritance, not by blood, but by ambition. France had long defined what it meant to live with grandeur. The chateaux of the Loire Valley, places like Chambord, Chenonceau, and Blois, were built for kings, dukes, and dynasties. They weren't just residences. They were declarations of dominance, artistry, and lineage. Their silhouettes, soaring roofs, pointed dormers, sculpted chimneys, became symbols of timeless sophistication. To borrow their form was to borrow their authority. But transplanting that form to the rugged cliffs of Newport required more than admiration. It required an architect capable of decoding Europe's architectural grammar and rebuilding it in a different cultural context. That architect was Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt had trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, the very institution that had shaped the architects of the Louvre and the Opera Garnier. He had walked the galleries of Renaissance palaces not as a tourist, but as a student, sketching every arch, every cornice, every flourish until he could reproduce them with mathematical precision. He didn't just know how to build in the French style, he thought in it. By the time he was approached to design Ochre Court, Hunt was already America's most accomplished practitioner of European-inspired grandeur. He had built for the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the nation itself, lending his talents to both private homes and public monuments. But with Ochre Court, he faced a new challenge: how to make a French chateau feel authentic in America, not as a replica, but as a natural evolution. He began with massing, the overall shape. The high, steeply pitched roofs of the Loire Valley were adapted to frame Newport's vast skies. Decorative dormers punctuated the roofline, creating rhythm and movement. Towers and chimneys added verticality, drawing the eye upward, while the limestone facade reflected the ochre tones of the surrounding cliffs, ensuring that the house would harmonize with the land, even as it evoked another continent. But the genius of Hunt's design wasn't just in how faithfully he echoed the French Renaissance. It was in how fluently he adapted it. European chateaux were designed for rural isolation, surrounded by formal gardens and moats. Ochre Court faced the open sea. It needed to withstand Atlantic storms, salt air, and the expectations of a society that measured status not in centuries of lineage, but in how well you entertained in July. Hunt responded by integrating modern structural techniques behind the historic facade: steel framing, electric wiring, and drainage systems that made the building as functional as it was beautiful. Inside, the dialogue between past and present continued. Grand staircases, vaulted ceilings, imported fireplaces, all spoke in the language of European prestige, yet the floor plan was American in its logic. Spaces for entertaining flowed seamlessly, optimized for seasonal gatherings, dinners, and dances. The private quarters balanced privacy with theatricality. Guests could move through the house as though drifting through a stage set, one designed not to mimic Versailles, but to outshine anything built that season in Newport. What made this architectural approach so powerful in its time was the message it carried. In a young country still forging its cultural identity, adopting the forms of European aristocracy allowed American magnates to claim a kind of historical continuity. As if to say, we may be new money, but our houses have old souls. And yet, there was something undeniably modern about this borrowing. The Châteaux of France had been built with labor taxed from the people, ruled by inheritance and bloodlines. Ochre Court was built with capital, swift, self-made, unapologetic. Its limestone walls might have looked to the past, but its foundation was pure Gilded Age. The guests who arrived at Ochre Court didn't need to know the name of every sculptor or understand the architectural lineage of each room. They felt it. They recognized the scale, the proportions, the weight of design. They saw the lineage, not genetic, but artistic. They saw a house that announced, "We don't need your crown. We've built our own court." And that was the quiet revolution of places like Ochre Court. They didn't just copy Europe, they redefined it. They proved that power and taste didn't have to be inherited. They could be constructed room by room, tower by tower, until even a French duke would feel at home. In choosing the image of a chateau, the builders weren't just chasing beauty. They were claiming legitimacy, and they succeeded, because more than a century later, the house still stands. Not as a copy, but as a chapter in a new tradition, one written not in the fields of France, but on the cliffs of America. If Ochre Court feels more like a chateau lifted from the banks of the Loire than a seaside mansion in Rhode Island, that is no accident. The man responsible for its design had trained in the very heart of European classicism, and brought that vision home with him across the Atlantic. Richard Morris Hunt was not just any architect. He was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and by the time he received the commission for Ochre Court, he had already established himself as the master translator between Old World elegance and New World ambition. Hunt was born in Vermont in 1827, but his education set him on a path far from New England landscapes. After his father's early passing, his mother took the family to Europe, believing that exposure to history, culture, and classical training would shape her son's future. In Paris, Hunt absorbed the very essence of architectural heritage. He didn't simply study buildings, he studied the philosophies behind them, the proportions that guided Renaissance design, the symbols embedded in Baroque ornamentation, and the discipline of spatial storytelling perfected over centuries. At the École des Beaux-Arts, Hunt became fluent in architectural languages that most Americans of his time could barely pronounce. He walked the halls of the Louvre not as a tourist, but as a draftsman. He sketched Gothic tracery, measured Romanesque vaults, and stood beneath the soaring ceilings of French chateaux that had hosted kings and emperors. When he returned to the United States in the 1850s, he brought with him something more valuable than blueprints. He brought authority. He had seen, up close, what greatness looked like in stone, and he intended to build it in a country that was still figuring out what greatness meant. For decades, Hunt struggled to convince wealthy American clients that architecture could be more than shelter, that it could be cultural positioning. He designed modest buildings at first, but his moment came when families like the Vanderbilts began to realize that Europe's aristocratic glow could, in fact, be bottled and poured into Fifth Avenue townhouses or seaside summer homes. Hunt became the go-to architect for America's elite, not only because he could build lavishly, but because he understood the deep symbolism behind every cornice, column, and pediment. To his clients, he wasn't just a designer. He was a passport to legitimacy. Ochre Court was a perfect convergence of Hunt's education, vision, and timing. The family who commissioned it didn't want a house. They wanted a message carved in limestone. They wanted their home to say, "We are not temporary." Hunt knew exactly how to answer that brief. He didn't offer them the kind of fashionable Queen Anne or shingle-style home that lined many American coasts. He offered them something timeless, authoritative, and unmistakably European, a chateau reimagined for the Atlantic cliffs. What made Hunt's work on Ochre Court especially remarkable was his ability to balance authenticity with adaptation. He knew that blindly replicating a French castle would feel hollow, even theatrical. So, instead, he interpreted. The scale was undeniably grand, but the building was carefully positioned to align with the coastline's contours. Its limestone skin wasn't just elegant. It was chosen to reflect the ochre-colored cliffs around it. Dormers, turrets, steeply pitched roofs, all borrowed from Renaissance France, were recalibrated to fit the Newport light, the ocean wind, the way American guests would move through summer parties. Inside, Hunt's precision only deepened. He collaborated with European artisans to install carved wood ceilings, marble fireplaces, and decorative schemes that spoke in fluent historical dialects. But everything had purpose. The circulation patterns of the rooms, the sight lines between parlor and sea, the way guests would experience the building from entry to ballroom. These were not accidental. Hunt composed them like a musical score, with crescendos and quiet moments, with formality and flow. The house didn't just contain beauty, it conducted it. Perhaps most importantly, Hunt understood that architecture, at this level, was a kind of theater. It was meant to stage identity, and he delivered exactly that. Ochre Court wasn't just a showcase of wealth. It was a performance of cultural inheritance, a performance made credible by the man who had spent years backstage in the salons and studios of Europe. In the history of American domestic architecture, Ochre Court stands apart precisely because it refuses to feel American. It doesn't echo colonial simplicity or frontier practicality. It doesn't compromise. Instead, it declares, elegantly, unapologetically, that taste can be constructed, that roots can be invented, and that legacy can begin not in the past, but in the precision of a pencil held by a man who knew the difference between copying history and extending it. Richard Morris Hunt didn't just build a house. He embedded a worldview into its walls, and because of him, a stretch of Rhode Island coastline became home to one of the most convincing illusions of aristocratic permanence that the New World had ever seen. The construction of Ochre Court was not simply a building project, it was an act of will against nature itself. From the moment ground was broken on the cliffs of Newport in the spring of 1888, every element of the process unfolded under the pressure of expectations that left no room for failure. The family who commissioned the house expected nothing short of a modern palace. The architect, Richard Morris Hunt, had a reputation to uphold as the nation's foremost interpreter of European grandeur, and the site, perched above crashing waves and battered by Atlantic winds, demanded engineering solutions as ambitious as the vision itself. 4 years would pass between the first excavation and the final placement of the gilded furnishings. Each of those years tested the limits of what late 19th century American construction could achieve. The land itself was the first challenge. Ochre Point was more than scenic. It was unstable, windswept, and relentlessly exposed to salt spray. Hunt's team had to anchor the foundations deep into the rocky bed, carving through layers of unpredictable stone to ensure that the house would not merely stand, but endure. Drainage systems were embedded to divert runoff from heavy storms, and the orientation of the building was adjusted to maximize natural protection without sacrificing its commanding view of the sea. The materials came from across the continent. Hunt chose a luminous blue-gray limestone quarried in Indiana, prized for its durability and the way it caught sunlight. Rail lines carried the massive blocks eastward, where they were transferred to barges and finally delivered by horse-drawn wagons to the construction site. Each block was carved and fitted by hand, shaped by stonemasons working through all seasons, sometimes under canvas tents in winter, their breath fogging in the air as they chiseled details into cold stone. Limestone formed the skin of the mansion, but steel gave it strength. Hunt employed a skeletal steel frame, a cutting-edge innovation at the time, to support the immense weight of 3 full stories, vaulted ceilings, and elaborate ornamentation. Steel allowed wider spans and taller rooms, and gave the structure a hidden resilience that would prove critical in the harsh coastal environment. This marriage of old-world craftsmanship and modern engineering made Ochre Court not just beautiful, but virtually indestructible. The rooflines, towers, and dormers that now seem so effortlessly elegant required months of labor and precise coordination. Copper flashing, slate tiles, wrought iron finials. Each element was custom fabricated, then installed at dizzying heights. Chimneys were built with sculpted stonework that had to be hoisted into place with ropes and pulleys. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Accidents were inevitable, though rarely recorded in society pages that focused only on the glamorous end result. Inside, the logistics became even more complex. Plasterwork crews shaped ceiling medallions and cornices according to Hunt's drawings. Decorative wood panels were carved, stained, and gilded in workshops before being shipped to the site. Flooring was laid plank by plank, often with imported hardwoods that had traveled farther than many of the guests who would one day admire them. Every room was designed with a specific function and feeling in mind, requiring different materials, finishes, and installation techniques. And then there was the lighting. At a time when most American homes still relied on gas lamps and candlelight, Ochre Court was being wired, from the ground up, for electricity. Not a few lights here and there, but full illumination. The family commissioned a private generating station to be built on the property, a steam-powered facility that would supply the entire mansion with current. Copper wiring was threaded through walls and ceilings before the plaster was sealed. Electric chandeliers, sconces, and fixtures were custom designed to harmonize with the historical interiors, and yet deliver a futuristic experience. When completed, Ochre Court had over 1,100 electric lamps, 6 times more than the entire town of Newport combined. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a statement of intent. While the mansion may have looked like something from the 16th century, it beat with the heart of the 20th. It was built for longevity, but also for evolution. Outside, landscaping work began even before the final stone was placed. The Olmsted brothers, heirs to the legacy of Central Park designer Frederick Law Olmsted, were commissioned to shape the 13-acre grounds. They carved terraces into the sloping cliffs, planted mature trees for instant gravitas, and laid walkways that guided visitors through carefully staged views. Every turn of the path was intentional, every flower bed a performance. The estate had to feel as timeless as the house, even if it had been composed in a matter of months. Through rain and frost, through storms and shortages, the work pressed forward. Hunt's team coordinated dozens of subcontractors, craftsmen, suppliers, and engineers, all under a tight schedule and stricter scrutiny. Delays meant spiraling costs, and costs had already climbed beyond even the original estimates. But this was not a project built to budget. It was built to last, and failure, structural or symbolic, was not an option. When the final scaffolding came down in 1892, the result was more than a finished house. It was a triumph over weather, terrain, and doubt. A mansion forged from ambition, fortified by steel, and born from stone pulled across a continent. Ochre Court didn't just stand on the cliffs, it conquered them. And in doing so, it became a monument to what could be achieved when a vision allowed no margin for compromise. When guests stepped into Ochre Court for the first time in the early 1890s, their breath was often taken not just by the scale of the interiors, but by something far more subtle and far more radical. The light didn't flicker. It glowed, steady and clean, without smoke, without the smell of burning gas. Chandeliers sparkled above them, sconces lined the walls, and hallways glowed in every direction, all powered not by flame, but by something still considered mysterious in most American homes: electricity. At a time when most mansions still relied on gaslight and candle power, Ochre Court stood at the cutting edge of domestic technology. It didn't just have electric lighting, it had its own power station, hidden away from the formal rooms, out of sight, and surrounded by mechanical noise and steam, stood a small but mighty generating building designed specifically to power the entire estate. Inside were steam engines and dynamos, complex machines that transformed coal and water into current, capable of lighting all these 200 electric lamps throughout the house, a number that exceeded the total number of electric lights in the entire town of Newport at the time. This wasn't simply convenience, it was a statement. The decision to wire Ochre Court for full electrification from the very beginning reflected not only wealth, but vision, a commitment to progress as unshakable as its limestone walls. Most homes of the era were hesitant to adopt electric systems. They were expensive, temperamental, and widely misunderstood. But the family behind Ochre Court didn't just adopt electricity. They built their own infrastructure for it. They invested in the future when the rest of the country was still clinging to the past. The integration of technology went far beyond lighting. The very bones of the house were engineered with a forward-thinking mindset. A hidden steel skeleton, rare for the period, ran through the walls and floors. A modern support system that allowed vast rooms and towering ceilings without compromising stability. This wasn't merely about safety or durability. It was about creating spaces that felt grand without being burdened by the heavy, load-bearing walls that had defined architecture for centuries. Heating systems were similarly advanced. Large boilers, tucked discreetly out of sight, distributed warmth through a network of radiators, making the vast interiors comfortable even during the coldest Rhode Island winters. Water was piped with pressure sufficient for private baths, and the kitchen was equipped with gas and coal ranges that allowed servants to prepare meals on an industrial scale, a necessity in a house built for entertaining hundreds. Communication within the house was also revolutionized. A network of call buttons, servant bells, and speaking tubes connected various rooms and service areas, allowing messages to travel instantly from the ballroom to the kitchen, from the master bedroom to the butler's pantry. In an era before intercoms or phones, this was as close to instant communication as domestic architecture could offer. For the servants who operated the mansion behind the scenes, it meant precision and efficiency. For the guests upstairs, it meant seamless luxury that appeared to run on magic. And it was magic, or at least, that's how it felt to many of the era's visitors. To walk into a house where lights turned on with a switch, where warmth radiated from hidden sources, where every room was connected to a silent, unseen network, was to experience the future before it had arrived anywhere else. For some, it was exhilarating, for others, disorienting. But no one forgot it. What made Ochre Court so futuristic wasn't just that it had modern technology. It was how invisibly that technology was woven into the traditional aesthetic. The house didn't look like a machine. It looked like a castle. Yet behind every carved panel and beneath every inlaid floor, innovation was humming. Electricity ran through copper wires hidden within walls designed to resemble those of a French château. Heat moved silently beneath ornate ceilings. Light fixtures were crafted in the styles of Louis XV and XVI. But they didn't flicker or smoke. They blazed cleanly, effortlessly. Even outside, the engineering spoke quietly but powerfully. Drainage systems kept rainwater away from foundations. The Olmsted-designed gardens were not only beautiful but functional, designed to guide storm runoff down sloped lawns without erosion. Stone terraces were graded to prevent pooling, and hidden grates ensured that water disappeared before it could ever become a problem. This blending of old-world opulence and new-world innovation defined Ochre Court in a way that few other Gilded Age homes could match. It proved that elegance didn't have to come at the cost of progress. It offered a vision of a future where tradition and technology could not only coexist, but enhance one another. And perhaps that's why the mansion still feels alive today. Because while other houses of the era remain beautiful relics, Ochre Court was never just a monument to the past. It was always pointed forward, not content to imitate European nobility. It dared to go one step further, to imagine what nobility could be in a new world, a world where castles had light switches, where ballrooms had thermostats, where chandeliers ran on wire and pride ran on steam. In the age of kerosene and gaslight, Ochre Court didn't just glow, it illuminated. Step through the front doors of Ochre Court, and the house wastes no time announcing exactly what it is. You're not eased in gently. You're not given a quiet foyer or a modest sitting room. You're brought directly into a space designed to disarm, to awe, and to signal, in no uncertain terms, that you've entered a domain where power dresses itself in ornament. This is the Great Hall, and it was never meant to feel like part of a home. It was meant to feel like stepping into a sovereign space, a personal Versailles, carved in stone, glowing under electric light. Rising 3 full stories, the Great Hall is the architectural equivalent of a prologue, but one written in gold leaf and vaulted ceilings. Every inch is intentional. Carved wooden arches soar overhead, their surfaces glimmering with subtle metallic highlights that catch the electric glow. Above them, a ceiling mural stretches across the dome, a swirling constellation of heraldic shields, classical allegories, and stylized flourishes that recall the ceilings of French palaces. And in the center of it all stands the fireplace, not built for this house, but imported piece by piece from a 16th century chateau in France. Its stone mantle rises like an altar, complete with carved figures and centuries of patina. It doesn't belong to the Gilded Age, it belongs to history, and that's the point. This room, like so many others in Ochre Court, isn't just decorative, it's declarative. It communicates hierarchy without a single word. You, as a guest, are small here, deliberately so. The scale, the proportions, the acoustics, they're all working together to elevate the host, to set the stage for power dressed as hospitality. Move deeper into the mansion, and you begin to see how this performance continues. The ballroom, for instance, was never just a place to dance. It was a place to be seen. Decorated in the elaborate German Rococo style, the room is a study in controlled excess. Ornamental plasterwork spirals along the walls, framing mirrors that double the room's apparent size. With every guest reflected endlessly, the illusion of a grander, more populated event takes hold. Crystal chandeliers hang like frozen fireworks, refracting electric light in thousands of tiny directions. On summer nights, when music spilled from the gallery above and every sconce burned brightly, the room didn't just glow, it shimmered with purpose. It elevated the event. It reinforced the host's role as cultural gatekeeper. Across the hall, the dining room tells a more solemn story. Here, the scale narrows, the colors deepen, and the mood shifts from spectacle to ceremony. Anchoring the space is a genuine Gobelin tapestry, a prized textile woven in one of France's most prestigious royal manufactories. These pieces were not just rare, they were near impossible to acquire without deep pockets, deeper connections, and the patience of a collector. For guests dining beneath its scenes, often mythological or historical, the tapestry was both decor and message. You are dining among those who can afford to buy history. The table settings, the silver, the crystal, all change depending on the occasion, but the structure remained the same. Long, formal meals, designed not just for consumption, but for coordination. Seating arrangements were planned with military precision. Alliances were strengthened, social rivalries observed, and reputations subtly elevated, or diminished, with a single placement at the table. Power moved not in raised voices, but in the order of wine service. Elsewhere, more intimate rooms offered quieter performances. Ogden's study, paneled in dark wood and lined with books, was not just a retreat. It was a masculine counterpart to the flamboyance of the entertaining spaces. Here, deals were discussed behind closed doors. Letters were written. Strategies were considered. A mural above the fireplace depicted Tudor scenes, evoking an English heritage that was more imagined than real, but no less effective for it. Even silence had weight in this room. It was a chamber of thought, and therefore, of control. On the other side of the house, May's receiving rooms and morning parlor showcased a different kind of authority. Light-filtered lace curtains, delicate furniture in Louis XV styles, floral wallpapers and subtle metallics. It was a femininity carefully constructed to disarm without ever relinquishing control. Guests might assume they were being welcomed into comfort, but they were also being assessed. Every cushion, every flower arrangement, every inch of embroidered silk sent a message. You are being received, not embraced. Even guest bedrooms played their part in this ongoing performance. Each was decorated in a different color scheme, with varying levels of luxury depending on the status of the occupant. Fine linens, imported rugs, and painted panels created an environment that was both indulgent and instructive. The hierarchy extended even here. Which room you were given was as telling as what was said to you at dinner. Downstairs, beyond the view of visitors, the service areas were constructed with just as much forethought, not to impress, but to maintain the illusion. Staff moved through a network of corridors and back staircases, appearing and disappearing at the right moments, ensuring that the machinery of the house remained invisible. Efficiency was enforced like choreography. Timing was everything. Meals had to be delivered at the precise moment the host turned toward the dining room. Coats were retrieved before guests reached the door. Silence was the language of competence. In this way, Ochre Court functioned as a kind of social engine, one that required constant fuel, careful maintenance, and absolute precision to run. Its architecture was not passive, it was active. Every room played its role, every detail reinforced a hierarchy. Every surface, polished, painted, gilded, told a story not just about taste, but about place. This was the true power of the interiors. They weren't just beautiful. They were strategic. They choreographed experience. They dictated mood. and they made it impossible to forget who stood at the center of it all, not as a ruler by law, but as a ruler by design. At Ochre Court, luxury wasn't the end goal. It was the tool. Influence wasn't spoken, it was staged. Behind the brilliance of Ochre Court, behind the golden ceilings, the glittering chandeliers, the 10-course dinners, and flawlessly executed summer parties, there existed an entire world most guests never saw. A world of doors that stayed closed, staircases not meant for society feet, voices that spoke only when spoken to, and movements choreographed not for admiration, but for efficiency. This was the domain of the invisible, the staff. Ochre Court did not function on elegance alone. It operated like a machine, intricate, relentless, and powered by nearly 50 individuals who lived in its margins. While society guests glided across marble floors, a butler stood silently nearby, tracking the rhythm of the evening with a glance. While fresh flowers appeared in every room each morning, gardeners rose before dawn to replace what had wilted. While the kitchen sent up trays of oysters, duck, and pastries, cooks below sweated in heat that never touched the dining room. This mansion, built to impress and entertain, was also built to conceal. Its entire service infrastructure had been planned from the foundation up to ensure that labor remained out of sight. Narrow back hallways crisscrossed the house like hidden veins. Servant stairs wound tightly behind the grand ones, allowing staff to appear precisely where needed and disappear just as quickly. The architecture made invisibility not only possible, but essential. At the center of the hierarchy stood the butler, a figure who, in many ways, knew the house better than its owners. He managed the footmen, supervised the wine cellar, and ensured that every dining setting was placed with mathematical precision. He understood the personalities of each guest, anticipated their preferences, and knew the exact moment to refill a glass or open a door. His discretion was as prized as his competence. The housekeeper, equally indispensable, oversaw the operation from another angle. She coordinated the maids, kept inventories of linens, arranged laundry schedules, and maintained the standard of perfection that the family expected without question. Her eye caught the wrinkle in the bedsheet, the smudge on a mirror, the misplaced teacup. She moved through the upper floors as a quiet enforcer of order. Below them, the cooks ruled their domain like generals in a war room. Preparing meals for 30 or for 300 required not just recipes, but strategy. Storage rooms had to be stocked, deliveries managed, meat hung, produce sorted. Timing was everything. A dinner service might involve 10 dishes, each requiring different temperatures, textures, and presentation. Failure in the kitchen didn't just affect the food, it disrupted the image the family projected. Maids were everywhere, though rarely seen. They lit fires in the early hours, dusted furniture before the day began, refreshed water pitchers, changed linens, and polished surfaces until they gleamed like new. Many were young women, often recent immigrants, whose lives unfolded entirely in service to lives they would never join. Their names rarely entered the family's conversations, but their absence would be noticed in seconds. Outside, another crew tended to the land that guests so admired. The gardens, designed by the Olmsted brothers, required a team of 12 gardeners to maintain their illusion of natural perfection. Shrubs were trimmed, flower beds rotated, lawns cut in straight, silent lines. The walkways, the stone steps, the terraces, all had to be swept, weeded, inspected. Even the trees had to be managed, their growth controlled so as not to obscure views or cast shadows where light was meant to fall. The stables housed horses and carriages, cared for by a team of coachmen and grooms. 8 men, dressed in livery, waited on call throughout the season, ready to transport the family or their guests across Newport. The horses had to be brushed, fed, exercised, and harnessed, all before the afternoon drive began. Even a single delay could create social embarrassment, and so every minute was accounted for. Altogether, the staff at Ochre Court moved through the house like currents beneath the surface, unseen but essential. They made the impossible look effortless. They allowed every chandelier to sparkle, every window to shine, every flower to bloom exactly when needed. Their labor was constant, precise, and largely unacknowledged, and yet their presence was everywhere. In the warmth of a towel waiting on a chair, in the gleam of silver catching candlelight, in the steam rising perfectly from a dish served at the exact right moment. The grandeur of Ochre Court was their performance, too, just staged in silence. For the guests and residents of the mansion, life unfolded in polished spaces filled with beauty and grace. But for the workers who sustained that world, life moved behind the curtain, in shared quarters with simple furnishings, on call from early morning to late at night, navigating a social structure that was as rigid as the one upstairs, though written in different terms. Ochre Court did not belong only to the family whose name was on the deed. It belonged just as much to the quiet hands who opened its doors, set its tables, and made its luxury possible. They were the gears in the clock, the shadows behind the light, the heartbeat inside the palace. And though history rarely tells their stories, every inch of the house still carries their fingerprints. Ochre Court was never meant to be lived in year-round. Like many of Newport's grandest mansions, it was designed for a season, a short shimmering window between late June and early September when the elite migrated north, away from the choking heat of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia to the cliffside breezes of Rhode Island. For most of the year, the mansion sat still and silent, its fireplaces cold, its chandeliers dark. But once summer arrived, it awoke, suddenly, completely, and with unrelenting force. In those brief weeks, Ochre Court operated at full intensity. The social calendar exploded with events, luncheons under silk canopies, formal dinners stretching long into the night, balls with orchestras positioned on mezzanines, and afternoon teas that served as strategic forums for gossip, matchmaking, and power balancing. Every hour had purpose. Every day was orchestrated like a theatrical season, with roles carefully assigned: hostess, guest of honor, rival, admirer. Even the house itself had a part to play, not just as a backdrop, but as an active participant in the performance. Preparations began weeks in advance. Carriages arrived with trunks full of gowns, tailored in Paris and fitted to perfection. Florists unloaded crates of roses and hydrangeas. Furniture was dusted, silver polished, guest rooms arranged like hotel suites, staff doubled, footmen in livery, maids in crisp uniforms, temporary help hired to support the strain of non-stop entertaining. Invitations were hand-delivered with embossed lettering. Declining was unthinkable. The rhythm of a single day in season could be exhausting even to witness. Morning rides along the cliff walk, followed by garden strolls and handwritten correspondence in the drawing rooms, luncheon for 30, quick changes into afternoon attire, tea on the terrace with a string quartet, a brief rest, if any, before the evening began, and then the real show. Candlelight dinners with 9 courses, speeches, toasts, dancing beneath frescoed ceilings, orchestras playing until midnight, sometimes later. By morning, the cycle began again. For the family at the center of it all, these rituals were more than tradition. They were strategy. Every event reaffirmed status, wealth, and taste. Each guest list was curated not just for pleasure, but for position. Appearances mattered, not only what you wore, but how you hosted, how gracefully you navigated conversation, how smoothly the staff delivered perfection on cue. Ochre Court became a kind of stage, and its owners, especially May, understood the script intimately. But beneath the glittering surface, there was a cost. Staff collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Flowers wilted in the relentless push to impress. Relationships strained under the pressure of appearances. And though the parties sparkled, the house's immense operating budget, including salaries, electricity, food, and maintenance, quietly devoured fortunes. Summer at Ochre Court was glorious, yes, but it was also unsustainable. A season of fantasy fueled by a year of sacrifice. And then, one year, the rhythm stopped. It happened not with a scandal or a fire or even the slow erosion of fashion, but with a single, irreversible event. The sudden passing of the house's patriarch, Ogden Gole. He had been the architect of the family's public presence, the financier behind every imported tapestry and marble panel. His vision, and his resources, had powered Ochre Court from blueprint to ballroom. When he departed the scene, everything shifted. The silence that followed was not just personal, it was structural. Suddenly, the great house, built to project dominance, became a reminder of absence. Its grand rooms echoed differently. Guests still arrived, out of habit, out of loyalty. But the force that had animated the estate was gone. Decisions became more cautious, events less frequent, maintenance delayed, and behind closed doors, questions grew harder to ignore. Could a house like this survive without the man who built it? Could a family sustain a legacy designed for eternal summer in a world that was beginning to change? May did her best to preserve the ritual. For a time, she upheld the parties, the guest lists, the floral displays. She smiled, hosted, and kept the house breathing. But the era had shifted. The Gilded Age was reaching its twilight. Incomes that once felt infinite began to show strain. Taxes rose, attitudes changed. America increasingly looked inward, toward modernity, toward practicality, and away from castles on cliffs. What had once been a symbol of unstoppable ambition now stood as something more complicated. A monument to a time, a marriage, a system that was no longer guaranteed. Ochre Court still glowed in the summer sun, but now its light carried a different tone, not triumphant, but elegiac. The house, once a beacon of presence, became a silhouette of memory, and in that transformation, it revealed something more human than opulent. The fragility that exists even inside walls built to last forever. By the early 20th century, the world that had birthed Ochre Court was beginning to vanish, quietly at first, then with increasing speed. The rituals, the fortunes, the rhythms of life that had once made mansions like this seem not only sustainable, but essential, were now being undone by forces that no one could stop. War, reform, and shifting national priorities cracked the foundations of America's inherited wealth. And even those families who had once ruled the summer seasons found themselves confronting a truth that would have once seemed unthinkable. Their homes were too large to manage, too expensive to maintain, and no longer made sense in a world that was learning to live smaller. For the Goulet family, as for many of their peers, the problem wasn't simply sentiment, it was arithmetic. The taxes imposed on large estates after the First World War grew heavier with each decade. Staff became harder to hire. Luxury, once a sign of American promise, was being recast as extravagance. The very thing that had made Ochre Court so powerful, its scale, now made it a liability. A house designed for dozens of servants, hundreds of guests, and constant activity could not be repurposed as a quiet summer home. Its greatness was tied to its maximum capacity. Anything less made the halls feel cavernous and absurd. The Great Depression hit not just banks, but the symbols of Gilded Age success. Families sold off artworks, vehicles, entire floors of furniture. Rooms were shut up to save on heating. Repairs were delayed year after year. The ghosts of past seasons remained, in scuffed marble, in fading upholstery, in the silent echo of empty ballrooms. By mid-century, many of Newport's once dominant houses had already been demolished or abandoned. Ochre Court still stood, but the question loomed ever larger. For how long? By the 1940s and 50s, keeping such a house no longer symbolized pride. It risked looking delusional. The economy had changed. America had changed. And Ochre Court, frozen in its elaborate late 19th century pose, seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of war rationing, suburban expansion, and the rise of a middle class that no longer dreamed of turrets and ballrooms. A mansion like this required not just wealth, but a worldview that had gone out of fashion. It had no owner who truly belonged to the era that was forming around it. It was a house without a master, drifting on inherited memory, and so came the moment of reckoning. Not just for the Goulets, but for all who had built monuments to a time that no longer existed. What do you do with a structure too grand to be lived in, too significant to tear down, and too expensive to save without help? Across the East Coast, similar questions echoed in the drawing rooms of fading dynasties. Some homes were gutted and converted into institutions. Others were left to rot, then bulldozed for parking lots or condos. But for a few, just a few, a different path emerged. Ochre Court arrived at this crossroads in the mid-20th century. The family still owned it, but its fate grew heavier with each passing season. Selling it to private buyers risked the house being carved into apartments, or worse, abandoned entirely. Demolition would have been cheaper in the long run, a clean break from the burden, but to destroy it felt like a betrayal, not just of lineage, but of something larger, a dream once shared by a generation that believed beauty Ambition and permanence could live together in stone. There were discussions, there were offers, there was the quiet, unspoken grief of recognizing that a house once built to project unstoppable legacy had now become a problem that needed solving. The family could not afford to keep it, but giving it away felt like surrender. And then, a third option. Not destruction, not profit, but transformation. It wasn't a simple choice, and it didn't come without pain. To change the nature of Ochre Court, to open it to the public, to hand it over to another institution, required letting go of control. It meant watching strangers walk through the Great Hall. It meant seeing the ballroom used for lectures instead of dances. It meant reshaping the house from a personal expression of dominance into a shared space for something else entirely. Yet, in that difficult shift, something unexpected happened. The house began to live again, not as a monument to the past, but as a participant in the present. And in that fragile balance between what it had been and what it could become, Ochre Court stepped back from the brink, not saved in the way its builders might have imagined, but saved nonetheless. The decision to hand Ochre Court over to an educational institution was not born out of sentiment. It was a choice made at the edge of necessity, a final act of preservation in the face of irreversible decline. By the mid-20th century, the Gilded family had come to terms with what many of their peers could not, that the age of private palaces had ended. No amount of inheritance could keep up with the crushing maintenance, the taxes, the labor demands, or the irrelevance of such grandeur in a world moving toward efficiency. But what if a place built for spectacle could be reborn through purpose? That question led them to the Sisters of Mercy, a Catholic order with a vision, to establish a college in Newport and to give education the setting it deserved. And so, in a quiet transaction that carried the weight of history, Ochre Court was given to Salve Regina College in 1947. With that act, a chapter closed, and another, entirely unexpected one began. The house that once measured its success in chandeliers and guest lists now opened its doors to students, professors, and administrators. No longer a private symbol of wealth, it became a shared engine of learning. Transformation did not happen overnight. The building had to adapt. Marble floors were preserved, but foot traffic increased 1,000-fold. The ballroom, once filled with music and whispered flirtations, was reimagined as a lecture hall. Rows of chairs replaced dance floors. Microphones took the place of orchestras. Professors now stood where footmen once waited. In a strange way, the grandeur of the space made learning feel sacred. Ideas echoed where string quartets once played. Guest rooms, once arranged for dukes and debutantes, were converted into modest dormitories. Ornate fireplaces remained, but now beneath corkboards and textbooks. Students wrote essays where letters of influence had once been penned. The soft hush of library study hours replaced the buzz of pre-dinner conversations. Maids' quarters became administrative offices. Servant staircases carried not trays, but backpacks. The house became a living contradiction. Old bones with new breath. But what's remarkable is how much survived. Unlike many Gilded Age mansions gutted for commercial use or lost to time, Ochre Court retained its character. The stained glass still caught the morning sun. The plaster ceilings, though carefully restored, still held the brushstrokes of European artisans. The great fireplace in the main hall still burned on winter nights. Now, not for royalty, but for students seeking warmth and quiet before exams. And something else began to happen. Students, many of whom came from modest backgrounds, found themselves immersed in spaces their ancestors could never have imagined entering. They studied beneath crystal chandeliers. They drank coffee on terraces once reserved for aristocratic guests. The very spaces built to exclude were now hosting the future. The irony was not lost on those who walked the halls, but neither was the beauty. Education saved what inheritance could not. In offering the house to learning, the family ensured that Ochre Court would not become a frozen museum, a lifeless shell, or worse, a footnote. Instead, it became a dynamic hybrid, part monument, part campus, part dream still unfolding. Students learned not just from books, but from walls, from staircases, from stone. Today, Ochre Court stands as the administrative heart of Salve Regina University. Staff still unlock the same doors. The ocean still roars beyond the cliffs. But the energy has shifted. Where once power was hoarded, now knowledge is shared. Where once hierarchy dictated every interaction, Now conversation flows freely. The house has aged gracefully and with a certain defiance. It is no longer pristine, no longer performative, but entirely alive. It is one of the few surviving Gilded Age mansions in Newport that continues to function as a lived-in space. Tourists pass by on the cliff walk, pausing to admire the silhouette of its towers against the Atlantic. Some may recognize it from history books. Fewer realize it is still in use, not preserved behind velvet ropes, but pulsing with students' voices, laughter, deadlines, dreams. Ochre Court endured not because of what it once was, but because of what it allowed itself to become. Its survival was not a victory of money, but of imagination. In choosing to live again, as something new, as something useful, it achieved something rare, relevance without ruin. The house remains. The legacy remains. But more importantly, life remains. And that, in the end, is the most enduring luxury of all.